Hello and welcome to AXSChat. Today is living proof that sometimes people with huge Twitter accounts and followings do actually read their stream. So we're welcoming Stephen Fry to AXSChat. Stephen, you've been part of my life in terms of following you for many years, since Friday Night Live and all of the sort of smutty stuff that I thoroughly enjoyed back when I was growing up, and until now, until this day. And it's great to welcome such a polymath to AXSChat. I know that you've had a somewhat sort of interesting relationship with Twitter. You said that it was wonderful, and you were an early adopter. And you really enjoyed it, and you thought it was something precious, and we still do here at AXSChat. But you also said that eventually people's behavior became akin to sort of somewhat peeing in the pool. So we like the positive aspects of Twitter. We understand there's lots of negatives and trolling and etc. But what are the good things that keep drawing you back? Because you've stepped away a few times.
Yes. I mean, I leapt at it like a blundering puppy running into a mirror, really. And when I banged my head a few times, I was puzzled and got up, as puppies do, and ran back. But eventually, that my forehead was so bruised that I did leave it for a while. It took me it took everyone a little while to get used to what this entity was, this social media. It was an experiment that hadn't quite been tried. It was along the lines of things that we were familiar with. You can go all the way back to the most primitive form of notice board and bulletin board that was used in the Greek agora or the Roman forum, and in British parishes and towns where people put up notices and other people read them and occasionally put a little notice underneath it. But scale matters in life, as we know, and things may be of the same kind, but when the order, when the number is different, it makes an immense difference. I mean, if you think about it, it's like selfies. If you're in the public eye and one person a week asks you for a selfie, it's rather charming, and you stop and you smile and you put your arm around them and you chat to them and ask them where they come from. But when every time you're on the street, someone sees you, they ask for a selfie, then each person, although it's not their fault, because they're just it's the first time they've ever asked for a selfie. They're not connected with the 40 people who've asked for a selfie that morning. Nonetheless, you feel aggrieved at them because they're the 41st. It's not their fault. And so scale matters a lot like that. I mean, road rage is explained by that kind of problem, that you blame the last one responsible for ruining your day, even though they did the tiniest thing. And it's the same with tweets. I found that I was getting cross and gnarly and just simply impatient with someone who wrote a perfectly charming tweet, but because it was at the end of a long cascade of ones that were questioning my right to exist or whatever. So I had to examine myself, and I think that's the important thing. It's no good asking the question of social media and other people as to whether they are good people, bad people, malicious people. You have to ask whether you are strong enough to take what clearly is the barking and the shouting and the snarling of lots of people, and whether you're also big enough to understand that some of the incredible kindness and sweetness and adoration is something that's not going to turn your head or make you feel that you're more important than you are. In other words, you just have to keep to the metaphor of the pool. I suppose you have to keep swimming in it to find out, how long you can stay afloat and when you need to get back out. The problem comes, it's not people's behavior peeing in the poo that's a nuisance. It's just you don't want to be in a pool that's been peed in. Do you see what I mean? It's simply that you may say, and everyone does, but everybody's so nice. And of course, I fundamentally believe people are good. If you throw a stone in a busy street, it's going to hit the head of a decent person, someone who's kind and thoughtful. Nonetheless, if you were to say to someone, here's this swimming pool, it's perfectly clean, 98% clean, except for that turd in the corner. Dive in. You're going to go, oh, I don't think I will. So it's just a long answer to a very simple question, but it's so important and interesting, social media. And from a personal point of view, I have to express that I won't say I invented, but because I was a very early adopter of Twitter, I was one of the first people in the public eye to use Twitter in a way that Donald Trump has mastered. Whatever else one can say about it, we could argue he's done that. That is to say, as a way of circumventing the press. Now, going back as far as 10 years, which is really all we're talking about, 10, 11 years from the beginning of it, it was generally regarded that the press was a bad thing and that they would misrepresent you and that they were monsters. So if you could circumvent them and speak directly to people and say where your show was going to be and what your next book was, it's all very venal, this, but essentially it's in order to stop having to do profiles for newspapers, in order to sell your goods, your film, your TV. Now, you see, if I have a book or a TV show or a film coming out, I can say to the PR people, I don't have to do any newspaper interviews. I can just tweet it. I'll reach infinitely more people. So that's basically that's the deal with the devil.
And I think that's fair, and it's very valid. Certainly, the deluge of comments, the selfie requests, the follow me back requests that you must get when you've got that network effect that you have must be tremendous. On the other hand, how do you think that we can leverage? I was going all American on you there. How terrible. How can we leverage that for the power of social media and the network effects for social good? Because I believe that technology is agnostic, effectively, but that you said you believe that people are good. So how can we use that for good effect?
It's a really interesting question. One of the things everyone's interested in at the moment in neuroscience and philosophy and so on is how much we are capable of acting as free agents in the world in any case, and aside from the deeper philosophical implications of free will, that there is a sense in which people are thinking, do I really make any difference that when people become a mob or a mass, which we used to picture as those holding torches, which unfortunately has recently come back into the public discourse, but holding torches in a town square, we now think of the mob not as those shouting out at Mark Antony, read the will, we'll hear the will, all that sort of mob number 3 actor, but as this extraordinary force on social media, which was never predicted by anybody, as far as I know, not even William Gibson quite got that angle of what would happen to our society. And one of the things I think of is an odd experiment that you went back to the 50s, and it sometimes makes me wonder whether this is the problem with everybody being aware all the time. We think of consciousness as being our great gift, but if you take a tank, a perspex, tank, acrylic, see-through tank that floats, and you put in a load of mice, say 100 mice, and they just float on the water. The mice will run around randomly and the thing will stay afloat. But if you put humans in a scaled up version of that, some sort of leaky raft, or not, doesn't have to be leaky, but you know what I mean? The moment they see that they're afloat, because they're conscious of the idea of floating, of the idea of buoyancy, of the idea of being able to sink, a whole load will immediately think, we're tipping slightly to port, so they'll rush to starboard, and they'll immediately sink. Immediately. You put humans in the same situation as mice floating, and they sink instantly because they're self-aware. And I have this sort of feeling that this is sort of still exists, that if everybody rushes towards one side because they see some wickedness is done, then it sort of tips over. It has the opposite effect of what is, instead of saving the world, it actually harms it. And partly that we see that in the cultural wars, as they're called now, which is another way of expressing, I suppose, the annoyance and the fear that's going on. Everything from the overreaction of some people and no platforming and safe spaces and triggering and what might be regarded as the political correctness that annoys the right, and you can see what's happening on the right as well. Everyone's just tipping over the edge rather than floating around in a nice aimless way, which we'd do if we weren't so exposed by social media and the news to everything that went on. And so everybody has to rush to one side or the other of the raft, and we're constantly sinking and never having time to stop and think. And that's the problem, I suppose, is that everything gets narrower. The current of history gets faster, and we just get more and more caught up in it. So the answer is I don't know. I don't know how social media can be used for an agency of good, except that if we, the one keeps trying, but that we tend to be in our own echo chambers, and it's a genuine problem.
I agree, and I think that I love that analogy, Stephen. And once again, we are very honored to have you on the program. To say the least, I have been a fan of your work for a long time, and I find it very thoughtful, your work. So, and we had talked about before we went live about how one tweet can just ruin your day. And yes, we have experienced that on AXSChat with generally most people love the work that we're doing because we are trying to make a difference for individuals with disabilities, but boy, people can get vicious. It's like, it reminds me of people driving a car and flipping somebody off because they think they're in a car. I don't know what they're thinking, but we can all see it. But yes, one thing I've looked at a lot of your work and tracked a lot of your comments, but the mental health issues that actually can come around because of social media. And I'll give you a personal example. I have a 30-year-old daughter that was born with Down syndrome, trisomy 21. And I found that she's very good with technology, but the more she's on technology without taking a break, she's on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, the more when I finally go in and say, no, seriously, you're going to have to get off the internet. You're going to have to get off social media and come and have dinner. And she just was really struggling with that. But it's not just a person with a developmental disability. We all have struggled. You've got almost 13 million followers on Twitter. And so I do believe a lot of good can be done on social media. We're an example of that. But how does the mental health issues tie into? I know how it has affected myself and my family, and you've talked about it a little bit, but I was just wondering if you wanted to delve into that a bit.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think when it comes to all these things, I'm entirely, entirely swayed by empirical evidence, not by rational evidence or what seems likely. And although one can say, or indeed anecdotal evidence, although that can be strong and one's own experience can obviously be a big guide to how one feels about what is done to the human spirit, the human socializing animal, when these conditions are laid down and when people are now growing up inside these conditions. And I think there are two things. One is to look back historically and see this has always been the case, but as ever, it is just more so. I mean, the nature of humans having to live in a city, and then if you read the language of people objecting to novels, firstly, and then popular novels, and then cinema and radio and television and comics and games, you will see exactly the same language in terms of fear about what's going to happen to our children, whether their brains will be softened and their ability to interact with each other in a real space be harmed or blunted or eroded in some way. And there's very little empirical evidence to say that's true. In terms of mental health, I think for a long time, one of the major problems, and there are many, the stigma, the problem of the condition itself, but one of the really major problems has been loneliness and a sense of isolation and uniqueness. And one thing where I think we can say with some confidence, issues of bullying and all the rest of it aside, that social media and the internet generally have helped enormously, and is in allowing platforms through forums and all kinds of different spaces like this one, and specialist ones, to allow people with particular syndromes, disorders and problems and issues or fears and anxieties to connect with others. Sometimes, of course, it will just be people bad in each other's face, nobody listening, and sometimes there'll be bullying, or you're not seriously bipolar, I'm more bipolar than you are, all this kind of nonsense. There will be, of course, there will, just as there are inside if you're having to be hospitalized for a while, you won't find all your fellow patients entirely charming. That's the nature of mental health. It affects behavior and mood and all kinds of aspects of social interaction. But given all those things, it is surely an unequivocal good to think of how many people may have been taught that they aren't alone. And I think we all know in both sides of the Atlantic, and I'm sure in other English-speaking countries, we're aware that the conversation is much more common now in terms you know, from everywhere. In Britain, it was from the royal family downwards or upwards, depending on your view of the natural place of the hierarchy of the royal family. People have been talking about mental health, and they've been talking about it in the workplace, in school, in the home, in society, and how it's reflected in media, in all aspects. In other words, we're now more conscious. And I think a lot of that is to do with social media, particularly Twitter in the early days, I think, and now obviously I guess Facebook and others do it in the Hangouts and all the various opportunities. And that I think we should at least celebrate that before we get on to other problems.
I agree. And I think that's very well said. And I want to turn the microphone over to Antonio now because he has a question. But before I do, I would say that I agree with you. It's almost like we're having a great social experiment on. I was listening to one of your talks where you were talking about, and I agree with you that the United States is, you know, a great experiment. And right now we're really experimenting, but I think social media goes hand in hand with that. So let me turn the mic over to Antonio.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I say something that has happened to us here on AXSChat is, and I can tell a story that happened to me a while ago, where somebody said, "Oh, I saw a tweet where you're talking about neurodiversity. I would like to talk with you more about that. Is there a way that I can have a conversation with you?" And I can share my Skype details, and we end up moving the conversation more privately to Skype. Inadvertently, I was in the street, and I end up showing her the city where I live in Ireland, in Cork. And while I was walking through the city and telling her what neurodiversity was in the context of the conversation that we were having on Twitter, that was actually during Global Accessibility Awareness Day in 2016, she would say, "Oh, I never came across that word, because we usually only talk about diversity, men, women." And we end up having that. And then I realized that the role of Twitter, where you can somehow have this type of interactions, and where Twitter works as a personal development place where you are able to communicate and share this type of experiences.
Yes.
I also had people who join, who have talked with me over a period of time and say, "I'm not able to, I don't engage on the Twitter chat, but I usually watch the stream because I'm afraid that my employer, somebody that connects with my network, will see me somehow having some type of engagement." So, and but so we're talking about a topic that is still not everybody is comfortable talking with. So what do you think is the role of people like you as a role model in terms of talking about mental health, neurodiversity? How can you somehow give through your story, help others to be more comfortable with their own lives and situations?
It's a very interesting question, Antonio, and it's one that people in the public eye live with a great deal. On the one hand, do you have the right to claim any extra insight, knowledge, or authority? Everyone has the same authority and insight as far as being alive and being human and having issues with the workplace, with diversity, with accessibility, with all the things that you deal with a great deal. So why should someone, just because they've been on television or written a few books, why should they be regarded as somehow as having any extra insight or authority? And I think it's important that we realize we don't have extra insight authority, but we do have extra opportunities. We have a bigger megaphone, if you like. We reach more people. And so we have to come at some point. Anybody who's in the public eye, whether they're a soap star, a musician, or a sportsman, whatever it is, they have to come at some point. They sit down with their agent or their manager and they say, "Well, what do you think I should do as far as charity and spokesmanship and all these different issues are concerned, because I'm getting all these letters." And if you're lucky like me, you become well known over a slow period of time. So the ramp, the gradient is quite shallow, but some people become famous overnight, and this whole thing lays on them, and they make foolish remarks. They're caught drunk saying something that then haunts them for the rest of their life. And impatient and unimaginative people then assume that this person must be a Nazi or a misogynist or a homophobe because they've said something silly when drunk. So everyone now has to be a little bit more careful. But I had certain advantages. I grew up naturally as a person who understood what it was like to be part of a minority, because I grew up gay at a time when it wasn't very easy, or as easy as it is now. Not that it's a finished thing, but you know. So I always understood that. Jewish as well, which is a minority in Britain, quite a considerable minority, but not that I'm a Judaic Jew, but nonetheless, it's, you know, if you're going to have your window broken by an anti-Semite, then you might as well identify with the group that has caused their ire. So even before social media existed in the 80s, I was aware of the fact that coming out, for example, was a reasonably rare thing for a well-known actor or comedian to do. But I could see the advantage it had, you know, and if I spoke at schools or universities or whatever, and at their gay societies, and I could see that it had made a difference, that in writing and addressing these things in the 80s and the early 90s, when, you know, things were not so equal. And then when it came to the mental health and talking about that, I didn't want to suggest that I'm not a doctor. The most distressing thing is to get emails and to be reached out to, as Americans like to say, by people who expect me to give them advice on psychiatry or psychology. All one can do is urge people to try and find their best route to a health professional, a mental health professional. But nonetheless, it was clear that mental health was not being spoken about, and therefore I was not quite unique, but in a position to say, look, of the two problems that mental health bring, and the stigma and diagnosis, of those two, that's something society can deal with. But first, everyone has to realize there are two very important and often seen competing issues with mental health. And one is how serious it is, just how many people die a year as a result of a mental health problem, through suicide, through self-harm, through a slow decline, through self-medication and other such things, and how difficult life can be. It's not something you can overestimate. It's a huge problem, what doctors call morbidity a problem. You have a shorter life. So you have to express that and not be coy about saying how serious it is. On the other hand, you also have to express the fact that it is possible to live a totally fulfilled, creative, fully socialized life, a love life, a life that's full of family life, a life full of love and creativity and achievement, with the worst kinds of diagnosis. And that's true in the mental and physical sphere, obviously. And so in both cases, you have to express two things that, as I say, there's a tension between them, the seriousness, but also the opportunity for it to be, not a problem anymore, for you to rise through it, and for yourself to stay stable and whole within a condition that doesn't define you, I suppose.
That's great. And I've talked previously about how people with hidden conditions, particularly neurodiversity, I'm dyslexic, and Deborah and I both had depression at various stages in our lives, need to take and learn from the gay rights movement. Because the gay rights movement has been very good at winning hearts and minds and bringing together a community. And I don't think that we have that same community amongst people with disabilities, particularly hidden disabilities, because people don't identify with it. So what do you think that we can learn from the LGBT community, and what lessons can we draw?
It's a very interesting question. And of course, because there is such a range of potential disabilities and issues that people grapple with, and it becomes easy for everyone to become balkanized and ghettoized. Indeed, we see that with comic effect in the gay community, because you've said gay and I say gay, but these days when you're being on TV, you have to remember how many initials there are in LGBTQI, and
don't forget the A.
It's become balkanized. It's become ghettoized. It's there's this one and this one, and there's no leakage between the barriers between an L and a G and a G and a B and a B and a T, and that's all a terrible pity, because the other part of one wants to embrace us all in a single hug, rather than say, oh no, we have these special needs and special requirements. Well, clearly with certain kinds of mental and physical disability, there are requirements. But an interesting sort of ontological question, I suppose, about disability is, and I think this is going to change enormously as technology begins to, the paces, the exponential rate of increase of AI and biotech and gene editing and so on is always going to bring us all so much more to the forefront in a very few number of years. But for example, in the old days, if you lost a leg, and it would be replaced by a prosthetic leg that pretended to be a leg. It would even, if you were a white person, be sprayed a weird kind of medical pink, because the idea was you were missing something that normal people had, and we can replace it and make you look almost normal. And similarly, a lot of people say with you, with your dyslexia, or me, I have a sort of similar issue that I do talk about. It sounds so silly and unimportant compared to many other people's issues that I rarely raise it, but that's prosopagnosia, which I have, which is a face blindness. So if I saw you in the street tomorrow, Neil, I wouldn't recognize you. You'd have to say, Steve, it's Neil. Do you remember? I stared at your face on the Google Hangout for half an hour, but the next day I didn't recognize it. That's a small thing, but it's a little akin to dyslexia, but less important perhaps. But in all of these cases, what we tend to do is hide them away as, and there's the rest of us, and then there's this little thing that we sort of make up for it. We compensate for this issue and join in the rest of humanity. And now you see, though, with the example of legs, people with prosthetic legs don't say, look, yeah, this isn't a leg. It's an alternative, form I have because my biological leg didn't develop or got lost in an accident or trauma of some kind. And so I have this, and I'm kind of proudly wearing that, and people get more used to the sight of people with fascinating prosthetics that bleach into biotech and all kinds of bionic things. And I think that will help the interior as well, that if you can be bold about that, then we'll be able to be bolder about who we are. And maybe that will mean there's less of a separation of each disability, each disorder being sort of somehow put into its own little box. Maybe there will be a wider sense of commonality.
It's certainly something that we're trying to achieve through what we're doing now. We decided that AXSChat was a pan-disability inclusion-based community, and we want to be as wide as possible. And what we're seeing, and what's gratifying, is that people from the deaf community are talking to people from the blind community, and they're learning from each other, and that's gratifying. And I think that we want that big group hub kind of thing that you've just explained. I know Antonio's got another question, and Deborah's queuing up, and time is pressing, so I'll shut up.
Okay.
Thank you, Neil. No, because we know that you have been publicly supporting the I Am campaign for Bipolar UK, and we would like you to talk about that and how do you get involved, and what role you think you have in that campaign?
Well, I have to be honest with you, Antonio. It's a campaign that I've been supporting very much at a distance. I'm in America. They've been doing it in Britain and in different parts of the world, and I agree to lend my voice. And I can't pretend that I'm there at meetings or plannings or strategic or tactical team leadership meetings or anything that can give me any particular insight into it, except that it struck me as a very good campaign, and that I was happy to lend my voice and face and whatever to it. I mean, it's so interesting that we never knew. For example, I'll choose the liver. If you were to dissect a human, or indeed any other animal that had a liver, and looked at it, you could never guess what it did. There's no possible way you could say this is a mixture of an extraordinary chemical factory, a heat exchange factory, and all the astonishing and analysis and all the things that the liver does. It's just a simple squad. It's not mechanical. You might guess, though it took mankind a long time to guess what the heart did, because it's a machine, it's a physical mechanism. But the liver, how do you guess? Well, the way you know how the liver works is when you see a bit of necrotic, a bit of dead liver, you know someone's liver isn't working. You see what happens to the whole body. You see, therefore, what a liver does in the body. And you think, ah, now I know how a liver works, because of its dysfunction teaches me its function. And the fact is, we all, no human being, not Usain Bolt, not Stephen Hawking, not anyone at any range of human achievements is a perfect human being. They have some dysfunction. And it is our dysfunctions that teach the rest of the world what a human being is. It's only when you have a hit, knock on a particular part of the brain, you realize that's how the brain does this. And so those of us who are what would have been called incomplete, or in some way not working properly, we are actually we demonstrate how things are supposed to be by being a sort of outliers in various things. And so, you wouldn't know, for example, how something as weird as spelling worked and reading in Broca's area of the brain if dyslexia didn't exist. And by comparing dyslexia in China to dyslexia in the West, which is entirely different, because it's a completely different nature of it. Now, so you do get Chinese dyslexics, but they would be able to read Western script very, very easily. And I'm sure you probably, if you learned Chinese, would find that no problem at all reading Chinese characters. So the fact is, there is without being all gooey and film of the week about it, there's a kind of gift that you can give if you are other. I think one of the privileges you find, I'm sure you find it in a group here, is that much as one can curse one's condition many times, partly because of the way society treats it, in fact, very often more than any other aspect of why one curses one condition is because society doesn't understand it, doesn't treat it right. But nonetheless, if you do the button test, which I've done with a lot of people with bipolar disorder, if you had a button, you could press it, and you would have your bipolar disorder taken away from you. You'd never have the ups, you'd never have the downs. Would you press that button? And a very small number say yes, very small, because there is, and this is perhaps where we learn from the gay community as well, the word pride, which is much mocked and perhaps overused. But if you can start to feel proud about your difference, I think you sort of resonate as a human being with far more depth and insight, and far more connection to other people. It gives you a natural sympathy with the world, and a sense, an anti-perfectionist sense. You don't believe that going for the usual golden prizes that society offers are actually of the value that you were once perhaps led to believe they were, and you start to have a set of other values, and perhaps it's worth saying there's a better one. And so there is that optimistic side to the fact that something you may have cursed when it first happened, when you were first aware of it, the problems it gave you, is something that actually maybe is not so bad after all. Maybe is actually something that helped you be a better, fuller person. I don't know.
Well, I think that was a really beautiful way to say it. And I know that we're almost over, and I want to make sure that I turn the mic over to Neil so he can thank our sponsor, Barclays Bank. But I just want to say a couple of things. I think if you are other, I love that comment, because the reality is we are all other. And I got a survey from a very, very large, well-known university in the United States, and I'm not going to say their name, and they were asking me questions like, if you could give your daughter a pill that had terrible side effects, including she might die, in 10 years, but she wouldn't have Down syndrome anymore, would you give her this pill? And I thought, my daughter, everything that makes up who she is, part of it is the Down syndrome, part of it is she has brown hair, part of it is she has a good sense of humor. And I didn't even know how to begin to answer that question, and I tried not to be very insulted by the question, and then I've had other people say to me, well, you know, they're wiping out Down syndrome in the Scandinavian countries. How do you feel about that? You know, I feel like that we're very complex, multi-dimensional human beings, and that my depression and my ADHD, me having a mother with borderline personality disorder has allowed me to grow into a very compassionate human being. So the question I'm going to throw to you, because I believe that I know the answer, and you have actually been part of the answer for me, is how can humor really start helping to heal the world? Because we're so afraid of each other.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think, you know, Oscar Wilde once said of a particular person, that person is not serious enough to have a sense of humor. And actually, a sense of humor shows a connection with people and an understanding with the reality of the world, with the detail of human life, rather than anything abstract, which is what I love about it. And I've had, you know, difficult conversations with social media friends, for example, in which I've said something light in a direct message, or when I used to do them, or some other form of communication, and they've said, "You making fun of me?" And I said, "No, that laughter is not always mocking. Laughter is a healing thing, and if you can laugh, you do know you're in a better place. It shows, it's a real indicator of health. I think you're right there. I
think we all feel the catharsis of being able to laugh. I think it's really important. I totally agree with you. We've reached the end of our half hour. It's been a real pleasure to have you talking. It's been great. Some really interesting topics and some insights in terms of social behavior and so on, which is great. I shall now be sort of thinking very carefully about how I unbalance the the petri dish in the water, yes, as a human with consciousness. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much, Stephen. We'll look forward to tweeting with you tomorrow night, and to thank Barclays Access for helping us with keeping the lights on and captions.
Yes, thank you, Barclays, indeed, and thank you, Neil and Deborah and Antonio, and thank you, everyone. And yes, we'll carry on with this.
Yes, thank you so much.
A real pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.